All right, thank you for joining me. We are here for 7.02 England, Civil War and Empire, Student Guide pages 189 to 194, your Human Odyssey pages 290 to 307. This is going to be a pretty long student guide fill-in, so you're going to need to probably stop and pause several times, okay? So we'll try and make this as quick as possible with getting as much information in as possible. So, our introduction. England, Civil War, and Empire. Has England always had a monarch? In the midst of the 17th century, conflicts between England's parliament and the king led to violence, war, a beheading, and a new kind of government, at least for a while. During this turbulent time, England was establishing colonies. All that religious and political unrest changed England and prompted some to flee to the to the east coast of North America. So our objectives, we're going to define political revolution, talk about the major events of the Restoration, explain the reasons for the conflict between James I and Charles I and the English Parliament, talk about on a map areas, countries that make up Great Britain, England, and United Kingdom. That'll be more during our class session and during your readings. Identify significant individuals and events in the English Civil War, and then recognize key goals, events, problems, and people in the settlement of the English colonies in North America. So James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England. So how did James VI, King of Scotland, and a member of the Stuart family become King James I of England? So just so you'll know, Scotland had 5 other kings named James. So this one was James VI. England had never had a king named James, so when he became King of England, he was known as James I. So I know, a little confusing, but just kind of a little background there. All right, so Elizabeth I of England was a member of the Tudor family, and she died without any children. So you learned about Queen Elizabeth during the last lesson. The King of Scotland, James VI, was her distant cousin. He became the next King of England in 1603. So here's a little chart on your student guide. You can see that's question number 2. So this is England's political structure in the 17th century. When you are watching this on your own, you may want to pause so you can fill these in. King James I succeeded Queen Elizabeth I, and the religion was Protestant. Primary duties, advise the English king, help make laws and impose taxes. You can see that kind of relates a little bit to our type of government, right? We have the 3 branches of government. So we have the first body of Parliament, the House of Commons, and then the second body of Parliament, the House of Lords. So the House of Commons were representatives who were elected. The House of Lords were nobles, and they inherited their titles. So again, you might want to pause this video and fill this in if you need additional time. So divine rights of kings. So King James I believed in the divine right of kings. He believed that kings received their power directly from God. He said kings only had to answer to God, not to Parliament. So again, you can relate that back to some of the things you learned in prior civilizations. Okay, so he believed he only had to answer to God, not to his Parliament. King James needed to raise money because he had inherited debts from England's long years of war against Spain, and he liked to live in luxury. King James tried to raise money without having to ask Parliament by imposing import duties. The king's action angered many members of Parliament. The Puritans. Puritans were followers of the Protestant reformer John Calvin. They wanted to purify the Church of England because they thought it was too much like the Catholic Church. The Puritans were disappointed in King James because he did not support their demands to change the way the church was governed or simply its ceremonies and rituals, even though he was a Calvinist. The king's luxurious lifestyle also offended the Puritans, who preferred plain and simple ways. Religious issues that caused more conflict between Charles I and English Parliament. So religious issues, Charles I, like his father, James I, believed in the divine right of kings. So he dissolved Parliament and tried to rule on his own for a time. Many members of Parliament were Puritans who opposed Catholicism, so they became very alarmed when Charles married Henrietta Maria, a devout Catholic. Political issues. Charles I needed money to put down a rebellion in Scotland, but Parliament did not want to help him. The Puritan members of Parliament wanted Charles I to accept limits on his powers and admit Parliament's right to meet regularly. For the first time in English history, the king went into the House of Commons and tried to arrest 5 of his leading opponents. The public turned against him, and days later, Charles I fled from London. So again, when you're filling in your notes, you can paraphrase some of this. You don't have to fill this in word for word, just so you're getting the basic idea and making sure that you do have your notes complete. What do you think? Is there anything James I or Charles I could have done to avoid the Civil War that occurred in 1648? Would you have chosen to be a Cavalier or a Roundhead, and why? And again, you need to have some background on this. That's why it's so important to have your readings done in your book. So when you go to fill in these notes, you have a good thought process. So there's no right or wrong answer. Please go ahead and fill that in on your own. That's an opinion question. So Royalists and Roundheads. By the summer of 1642, the English people were divided into two groups. Royalists, those who backed the king, because many of them were dashing horsemen. They also became known as Cavaliers. Or the Roundheads. They were Puritans who supported Parliament. They earned that nickname because some wore their hair cropped short and round against their faces. Both sides were armed and ready. They had cavalrymen, musketeers, and gunners manning cannons. So there's two different, totally separate groups, the Royalists and the Roundheads. So the Roundheads win the English Civil War. Who helped the Roundheads win the war? They fought the king's armies across England, especially in the north and west of the country. Thanks to Oliver Cromwell, they won great victories. The Civil War results. The Royalists were defeated. Charles I was tried before a special court set up by Parliament and was executed. England became a commonwealth with Oliver Cromwell as the Lord Protector. Cromwell's rule changed things. Cromwell closed Parliament by force and ruled England as a military dictator. Cromwell and his supporters closed theaters and other forms of entertainment that they saw as immoral or evil. They banned Christmas and Easter celebrations, and they tried to force people to accept Puritan religious beliefs. They also invaded Ireland and Scotland and crushed all resistance. Restoring the monarch after the Commonwealth. The English people had enough of Cromwell's military dictatorship. Many longed for a return of the monarchy. The nation thrived during the Restoration. Theaters reopened, elegant buildings rose in the capital. Philosophers, architects, and scientists made great advances under the reign of Charles I. And when I say reign, I mean under the ruling. How did Charles II treat Parliament, and how did he treat the Puritans? Charles tried to maintain good relations with Parliament. Charles supported the Church of England, but had Catholic sympathies. Many Englishmen were tired of the strict ways of the Puritans, and Charles was happy to help the Puritans leave England, sometimes granting them land in North America. And we'll learn more about that towards the end of this slides. Civil War or Revolution. It could be described as a civil war because there was a conflict between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. So remember, a civil war is fighting between one country. Or it could be considered a revolution because the government changed from a monarchy to a dictatorship. King Charles I was executed and a commonwealth was established. Oliver Cromwell was elected as the Lord Protector. He acted like a dictator while ruling England. Considering the information, the conflict in England could be considered either a civil war or a revolution, depending on the information used to support it. So that would be a good question, and then you could use supporting examples if needed. So Jamestown Settlement, Virginia Company of London. The company's mission was to colonize Virginia and find gold on the eastern shore of North America. Jamestown was established in a swampy spot alongside the James River. The settlers were upper-class gentlemen looking for adventure and poor vagrants from the streets of London. The settlers were more interested in looking for gold and playing cards than building homes. Captain John Smith became the leader of the settlement in 1608. He set up guidelines and rules for the settlers to follow. He forced the settlers to work in fields and to build a fort. The Virginia Company sent about 10,000 men and eventually women between 1607 and 1622 to Jamestown. Only 1 in 5 colonists survived, so only about 20% of the people that went survived. John Rolfe helped the colonists to survive, the ones that obviously did survive. He taught the Jamestown settlers how to plant and harvest tobacco. The colonists sent the harvest to England, where tobacco sold for 5 to 10 times as much as it cost to grow in Virginia, and tobacco became Virginia's main cash crop. The planters got laborers for their fields from Africa, as we've learned in the transatlantic slave trade. Separatists and Pilgrims. The Separatists were Puritans who had grown so discouraged with the Church of England that they separated from it and formed their own congregations. Bradford and Brewster looked to North America as a place to settle because they believed North America was a place where they could worship God as they saw fit. Pilgrims were the Puritan separatists and non-Puritan strangers who settled in Plymouth. Mayflower Compact, Plymouth Colony, and the Massachusetts Bay Company. The Massachusetts Compact was an agreement signed by 41 men that stated they would meet from time to time to pass just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. The Mayflower Compact was important because it established the precedent that the colonies would govern themselves. The Plymouth Colony was established on the rocky Atlantic coast. The Pilgrims believed they honored God best when they worked hard. They planted crops, fished, hunted, and built houses. The Massachusetts Bay Company was a charter which gave the company the authority to be a self-governing community as granted by King Charles I. He hoped the settlements would send back timber, fur, and that someday they would start paying taxes. The king also used the colonies as a means of rewarding friends or getting enemies. Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore named his colony Maryland because he said he was naming the colony after King Charles's wife, Henrietta Maria. But since he was Catholic, he may have also wanted to name the colony to honor the Virgin Mary. He opened his colony to any Christian because he wanted to prove that Catholics and Protestants could live together peacefully. Peter Stuyvesant and the colony of Carolina. Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of New Netherland, a colony controlled by the Dutch. He surrendered the city and the colony to the English because he wanted to fight for his colony. His soldiers did not have enough dry gunpowder, and the settlers of New Amsterdam begged him to surrender before their homes were destroyed. The colony of Carolina appeared to have a promising future because the rich soil and fine harbor of Charlestown made the colony enticing. Tobacco grew well there. Rice and indigo also became important crops. And again, these are just bits and pieces to add into your note. Please make sure you are doing your readings to get more background and more knowledge. William Penn, King Charles II, and the system of government. Here we're going to tie back in where King Charles paid debt to people that he owed. So King Charles II owed a debt to the Penn family. To pay the debt, the king gave William Penn a large tract of land over in the Americas, which was named Pennsylvania. Penn promised settlers religious freedom and self-government. The system of government most English colonies practiced nearly every American colony had its own elected assembly that passed laws for the colonists. Colonists had to own property in order to vote for representatives to the assembly, hint, hint, a little bit like our representatives today, right? But property was cheap, so many male colonists voted. Each colony also had its own governor. The governor was sometimes appointed by the king, but he was often paid by the colonial assembly. The best poor man's country and trade between English and English colonies. The colonies could be called the best poor man's country because land was cheap, labor was in demand, and a poor person could pay for the voyage across the ocean by agreeing to work for 4 to 7 years in the colonies. Trade between England and the English colonies was the beginning of the American economic system. The English colonies sent lumber, fur, rice, tobacco, and iron ore to England. The colonies bought manufactured items like pins, fine cloth, thread, and guns from England. So I know that was a bit longer than our normal, keeping it close to 10 minutes. And if you have to go back and pause the video, please do so to make sure you get all of your notes filled in. So we come to the end. Big things often have small beginnings. Thanks for joining me.